I thought I understood the Holocaust, the Shoah. I taught its history in the classroom. From the pulpit, I spoke of the ethical consequences of a world gone morally mad. I joined in demonstrations against man's continuing inhumanity to man, each time renewing the promise, never again. All the while, I encouraged survivors of the Shoah to speak their message to the anti-Semitic bullies of our town. I thought I understood this nightmare which decimated our people. But then I went with my youngest son on the March of the Living. We traveled to Poland, crossed through the killing fields, and for the first time I began to feel the enormity of it all. We passed by nameless graves, where silent screams were still unanswered, by a world where some yet denied responsibility, while others hung their heads murmuring, "But what could we do?" Leaving Poland for Israel, the challenge of the Shoah struck home. We were at Yad Vashem, Israel's national memorial to the victims of the Shoah. One picture of a little boy lying helplessly alone on the streets of the Warsaw Ghetto, for me personally, cried out the anguish, despair, and tragedy of the Shoah. For you see, that little boy was wearing a coat and cap very much like one I once wore, only his was tan and mine was black. There I was, standing between my father in his United States Coast Guard uniform and my mother in her mink coat. There he lay, dying on the ghetto streets of Warsaw. Mother's age-old admonition kept ringing in my head. She, born in Poland, the great-great-granddaughter of the famous Kotzker rabbi. Her rabbinic family didn't want her to leave Poland for what they perceived to be godless America, where in their mind Judaism stood no chance of surviving. She, who spent her early childhood in a primitive shtetl, while her father's family Warsaw apartment lay within what became the ghetto at 33 Niska Street, perhaps only a doorstep away from where the little boy lay dying. She would often say, "There but for an accident of birth, it could have been us, in the ghettos or camps of Europe." Or in a more theological moment, "There but for the grace of God, we were spared." Today I am still searching for meaning to the human anguish we call the Shoah, as I have returned to Poland several times, gathering whatever meager information I can of our lost family's history. In an unending search for some understanding of those days, I video interviewed survivors of the Shoah, and that is how I found Fredzia's story, A Stolen Childhood.
I die with a joyful heart in the knowledge of our infinite achievements and of a contribution unique in the history that bears my name. This war will not come to an end the way the Jews imagine, with the extermination of the Aryan people. Instead, it will see the complete annihilation of the Jews. I do not play at war.
Zachor gedenkt. In whatever language, we must remember.
My name is Frida Jaffe, or in another life I was known as Fredzia Geltzman, born in Piotrków, Poland, which is central Poland, very near Lodz. And that was my beginning in Piotrków, but then my parents and I, and later on a baby brother, lived in a small city called Lututów, also in Poland, about maybe 100 kilometers from the central Piotrków, Lodz area.
Fredzia, how old were you when the Shoah began?
I was born in 1937, so I was 2 years old at the outbreak of World War II.
You tell us about your life before the Nazi invasion.
Oh, I have some lovely photographs of me on outings with my parents when I was probably 3 years old. It must have been maybe the war had already started, but just not gotten to Lututów yet. Always loved to be outdoors, always loved to be around flowers and gardens. And at that point, as far as life with my parents, or don't remember the birth of my baby brother, that was later.
Fredzia, when the war touched your young life, what do you remember?
My very, very young, as I call it, my so-called childhood really has to do with some pretty traumatic things that happened. The first huge event that I do remember, that it was in January of 1942. My father was publicly executed by hanging in Lututów, and I very clearly remember the day that troops, I don't know whether they were Nazi troops, German troops, Ukrainian troops, or just the local police, but there were people in uniform who broke into our home and literally dragged my father out of bed. He was ill. I really can't tell you the noise, the fright. My mother was in the process of curling my hair. I was sitting on a bench at the foot of my father's bed, and we were forced, along with the entire population of the town, to the town square to witness an execution. Apparently there was a war crimes trial in Poland in the late 1970s or early 1980s. Had nothing to do with Jews, Nazis, but it had to do with the Nazi regime against Poles and war crimes that were committed against Polish citizens during the occupation. I found out that one of the people that was brought to this trial was the commandant of Lututov. His name was Ditberner, and the Polish government was charging him with war crimes. And because of Ditberner's activities during the occupation, something was brought up about the execution, and it is very much documented in a number of books, of one Joseph Geltzman. And the testimony that was given was, one of them was that the personal enmities against Joseph Geltzman was that he refused to turn over. My father was a master tanner. They had always been in the leather business, leather factories. And apparently he had, from what someone in my family had told me, he was a chemist. And he had created or discovered a tanning process where he could take useless animal hides that prior to that had just been thrown away. And if we know anything about how much the Germans loved their leather, you know how important leather was for them, for their boots, for their belts, for their uniforms and all. The factory, all the Jewish businesses had been confiscated and turned over to German or Volksdeutsch, Polish nationals. Nobody will forget the strength and the pride with which Joseph Geltzman was led to the gallows, and that the only thing, and it's in my testimony that I have, that the only thing that he asked of his citizens was to please take care of his wife and children. He didn't ask anything for himself. He was hanged, and to make the point even more clear to the citizenry, according again to the testimony of these people at that trial, his body was left hanging in the square for hours, even long after the townspeople, including my mother and my little brother and I, were told to go back to our residence. But he was left hanging there until two other Jewish citizens finally went and cut him down. And he was buried. At that time, there was a Jewish cemetery, either in Lututov or very near there. And by the way, Rabbi, I have it on good testimony. I've had it researched. The place that was supposedly a Jewish cemetery then is a garbage dump used for disposing garbage in Lututov today.
Fredzia, I understand after your father's death, your mother and you and your brother went to Pietrkov to join the family. Can you tell us about that?
I don't remember. I don't know what happened to us. Apparently my mother had help. There was no way that she could have gotten out of the Lututov ghetto with an infant and a small child, and somehow wanting to go back to be with her family, my grandparents, my uncle. There were a lot of relatives in Piotrków, in the ghetto. But Piotrków was a very large ghetto. It was the first documented ghetto in Poland. And somehow we did end up. So I have a bit more recollection about the ghetto in Piotrków than I do in Lututov, because the Lututov ghetto was not a closed. There weren't enough Jews to really have a closed ghetto in Lututov. It was just a couple of designated streets. So I don't know how she did it.
Fredzia, could it possibly have been help that your mother received from the parish priest that enabled her to join the family and get to the ghetto in Piotrków?
Yes, and that's the big, because our house was directly across from this very large, I call it a cathedral. It was really a big, big church. Still remember me. This is a photograph of me sitting just on some broken steps with my favorite purse. You know, it just occurred to me not long ago, I don't know anything about this handbag, this purse, but my father was in the leather business. And chances are pretty good that he made this handbag for me. But I clearly remember that I would never step out of the house without that purse and that little white dainty apron that I insisted I would not walk out the door. I remember that very clearly. So I'm sitting on this step, which is, it's really hard to see on this particular picture. It's a little bit easier here. Those were the steps of the parish house, which is where the priest lived. And the church, this was our house right here. As popular and well known and respected as apparently my father was, the locals, even though now it's their children and grandchildren that remember, they still refer to the house, and it's still on her grid. They call it the Geldsman house. When she was talking to the locals in the marketplace there, and said if anybody had distant relatives or perhaps grandparents, did anyone remember Joseph Geldsman? And they said, Joseph Geldsman, that's the Geldsman house. And they still refer to this particular building as that, and it has today the notoriety of after the ghetto was, well, sort of terminated, and after the hangings, the little transports from that small town were to some of the concentration camps. I'm not sure which ones, but that became the Nazi headquarters in that town. Geldsman House became the central bureau, and then later, years later, it was the communist headquarters. So even though it's been different buildings, it is still known as the Geldsman House. And my researcher was trying to be very clever, and in one of her correspondences she said, oh, and the woman who owns that building now, it's for sale. Though it needs a lot of work, Frida, you might be able to buy it.
Fredzia, let's continue with your memories of life in the Piotrków ghetto.
How does a 5-year, by then I was 4.5, close to 5 years of age. It was a time of, about the only thing that I can honestly tell you is that all I can really remember is fear, hunger, pain, and just terror. Every day there were things that were going on, and of course we were with my grandmother, my grandfather. There were several other aunts, sisters of my mother who were still living there. I wrote an essay at one time, you might have heard it during Yom HaShoah many years ago, where I described the things that we were so afraid of, and there were bombings and shootings and being being me, if I heard anything, I would run to the window, and the windows in the building were very big. It was a major street. Pilsudskiego was just one of the main streets, and it turned out that it ended up being within the ghetto itself, but because it was sort of a border street, my grandparents did not have to leave the apartment. Others were jammed into some of the rooms, and as they were brought in from some of the other ghettos, but we stayed there until that fateful week, that terrible week in October when all the deportations were. But I remember the fear. I remember just looking out the window and just seeing people were being beaten, people were being literally shot on the street. And in my essay, when we were very scared and very frightened with things that were going on outside that we heard of, we would all huddle, meaning whoever was in the house or in the apartment, we would all huddle into a closet. But it really wasn't a closet at all, because I remember in the back of the closet, somehow my grandparents would push this wall aside, and it was a small room. And during all those periods, a child will play. A child will find things to play with, even if it is just their own clothing. But in moments of stress, they need to play. Unfortunately, I had to learn to play very silent games. And one of the silent games had to be to shh. You can't talk, you can't laugh, you can't cry, you can't be heard while we're in this gathering place. I don't even remember for during those times the luxury of laughing or crying. I apparently had the reputation in the Piotrków ghetto of, as I tell some students when I speak to them, they think that Harry Potter had the first invisibility cloak, but I tell the students that they're wrong, that Fredzia was the very first one to have an invisibility cloak, because for all the shenanigans that I, as a small child, got myself into, nobody saw me. I just was not visible. So I must have had an invisibility cloak over me. It's the only reason I can think of that I'm sitting here speaking with you.
October 1942, the liquidation of the Piotrków ghetto. Tell us, Fredzia.
Yes, that's been very, very highly documented. October, I think it was from the 14th, it was a 7-day period where the trains departed from the Piotrków, from the city of Piotrków, from the town square. The citizens were rounded up every single day for that entire week, and the cattle cars were filled every single day. I didn't know that then, but as the names were called out on a daily basis, when the quota was filled and the cars were filled, they departed, and then the next day the same story. And that final destination for the people there was Treblinka, and it was a one-way trip. My mother and my baby brother were one of those days. My grandparents, my aunts, just almost the entire family. The only ones that did not go on those transports during that week was one of my mother's sisters and a brother, and me.
And Fredzia, how did you escape the trains?
Well, I don't know how I escaped it. Things happen. I was Fredzia, and when we apparently had to stand at attention or stand in that square for hours and hours on a daily basis, there wasn't any way that Fredzia was just going to do that. And so, being close to the ground, I just wandered around. I wove my way. I remember weaving my way through legs, looking for things to play with. There were probably some mice or some rats or some animals that I befriended that I just had to take care of. After all, they needed me. And it wasn't until I heard Paula Geltzman. I heard it being called that. Well, that's Mama. And so wherever I was with this multitude of people in this town square, working my way again through their feet to run, to be, if my mother was, her name was called, I needed to be there. She was holding my baby brother. Rabbi, I can't even, when I think about strength, and I think about courage, and I think to myself, I saw the back of my mother as she was holding Shimek, and I could see him looking over her shoulder. It was far, it was a distance, and I'm running through, and I'm yelling, I am screaming, Mama. And by the way, that is the last time I have ever been able to use the word Mama. That was it. And I remember as I was trying to push through the crowd, through the feet, I was grabbed. And someone put a hand over my mouth and just shoved me to the ground. I wasn't very high off the ground. It was my Aunt Gucha, my mother's sister. And she kept me down. And then I stayed with her until she was sent off to a labor camp. And then I was with my Uncle Bernard, my mother's brother, who was also doing slave labor in the ghetto in Piotrków, until he was transported. And then I was passed on to whatever distant relative by marriage still happened to be in the ghetto until the final liquidation toward the end of 1944. But to go back to my mother, I recently wrote an essay, a paper, and I was trying to describe strength and courage. And I was really trying to think, how do you describe a mother who is walking purposely, she has no choice, toward the trains, toward the cars, and hears her child calling, and has the strength, has the courage, has the fortitude to not turn around, to not acknowledge her child, knowing that if she did, that child would be joining her on whatever journey. She did not know where her journey was leading, but she did know that she didn't want me there. And when I think about that, it just, who can do that? Who? That's